Alrighty. So Rio here, and let's actually here in week 7 build something because I think the best way to learn something is to actually build something. Like I find that theory is great, and I think you need a certain amount of it as we go through. And then, so as an example, like last week when we talked about arrow functions, right? And I talked about in general we could use these going forward. One thing I would say is it is good to go ahead and declare, right, our functions, because that it makes our code more resilient. And the other thing I would tell you is, this is kind of the standard way we see functions written. And it's not that we will never do that. There's going to be situations as we move forward where we learn when it's best to use a particular way of writing functions. But this is true with anything in programming languages, okay? Just true across the board. All right, so what I've done here, and I'm going to go ahead and close this out, and I have set up 002 start building. I have my index file, I have my JS file. Now, one thing I'm going to add to my index file this week, besides just the H1. And by the way, when I'm working in HTML and JavaScript, one of the things I like to do is actually have them, and you can use this if I close it. I did it without showing you. Right here, you can view them side by side or split it. And the nice thing about that is I can go back and forth. So like for me, I like to have my HTML over here. I'll close that. So I have my JavaScript here, my HTML here, because in the beginning, I'm going to do a little work on both sides. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a div. Okay. A div, if you don't have any HTML, is just a section of the page that I can control, block level elements. And if you don't know that, don't worry about it. But I'm going to say ID equal. Okay. I'm going to say, let's say output. Okay. Now, this is because we're going to actually update the DOM. Okay. And this is part of what I want to start with, because we're going to continue talking about functions and writing a function that updates the DOM. Right. So that's the first thing, is we have that there. And if I move over to my output, just to show you, I have it setting here. If I refresh, now I'm setting in sources already, but by default, if I come into the body, I can see my H1 and I can see my div here that I just created. Now we're going to end up writing things that update the DOM, right? So what is the DOM? And in this case, you can see the DOM by looking just at the console. So if you don't, you have just a console button, which is cool. You have elements, which also has an integrated into the bottom console. And then I like looking at things like this, which is the source. And then in source, I have my JS file open. And then down here is where, because this is most of where, when you're using DevTools, you're interacting. Okay. So if I go down here, and you can type commands, I showed that last week, and the more you learn DevTools, in my opinion, the better you learn the language. But if I type document, which by the way, document in this case is the representation of the DOM. So if I hit enter here, it outputs something, and notice when I just roll my mouse over it, it selects this whole page. And in that case, it's because it represents the whole thing. And then I can actually drill down a little more specific here, right, to what is in the DOM. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to update the DOM. All right, so let's go back to doing that, back to VS Code. Right, so the first thing I'm going to do is build a new function. I'm going to actually, in this case, give it a name. I'm going to say update DOM. Now, in this case, remember I'm using camel case, really important. I'm going to say equals, open and close parentheses. I'm doing an arrow function, and because my function is going to do have more than one expression, right? That's what I talked about last week, is if you're just by default returning something, you could just write the expression here if it was one line. But in our case, we need to do actually a couple of steps. Okay. So far, so good, hopefully. Right, so now in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a new variable that's scoped inside of this function. I'm going to call it div element. I'm going to say document dot, and this is where I'm saying, okay, on that DOM, query selector. Now, there's different ways to do this, but let's actually see it and then we can talk about it, okay? Query selector, and I could, in this case, specify that ID. okay, query selector, and I could say output. Okay, there we go. Now let's move over to the browser and see at this point, right, what that is. Now, why can't can I just type div, div element, right? Or why can't I look at it here? So if I type div L, well, DevTools is trying to make my life easier by actually auto completing, which I don't want it to. Div EL space, that's lowercase. It's not defined. Why is that? Any guesses? Okay, why is that not? Because I have not at this point invoked it, right? I haven't said update DOM yet. Now, remember when I call a function, right? And by the way, there's more terms, more not only theories, but terms here, right? So these are arguments. We talked about where you can pass things into a function and they're locally scoped here. But I can also just pass nothing into it. I can just call it, right? So if I come back here to my browser, now that I have that in there and I run it, now can I type div el, right? I love that. Okay. Okay. And in this case, it's run, but because it has already completed by this point, this is where, setting that breakpoint, going here, and now stepping through the code, right? Right here. Now I've defined it. Okay. Oh, div selector. Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I forgot something here. Okay. Because I believe, let me see if I'm right. Let me see if I'm right here. Good. Let's see if I'm right. So basically when you're running the query selector, I had just inside the strings output. Okay. Now the query selector is very flexible in the way that you can select DOM elements. And in this case, because I gave it an ID, I also needed to include the pound. Now there also is document.get element by ID. I could have been that specific to say that, but sometimes it's nice to start with query selector, and there's reasons why. Generally with anything, especially with the DOM, there's just generally 20 ways to do the same thing. But what does this give us now that we know that it's there? Now you might wonder, well, what do you mean it's there? Okay, well, when I rolled over that before, it said null. And null, now it does show things in here that are null, but it was null because it couldn't find it. So if I go over here, now that I'm paused inside the function, I can type div el, and it now will, and you can even see what it's doing here, is it's actually pointing to that div. Now that div in the HTML doesn't have anything in it, okay? But I at least now programmatically through the code have access to it. Okay, and that's part of what we have to do when we update the DOM. So now what I'm doing is basically telling my code, hey, look in this div, okay, point to it so that I can then do something to it. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up another variable. I'm going to call it P. And this time, again, document, but this time I'm going to do create element, okay, and I'm going to call it P, right? Now I could create an H2, okay, I could create any kind of element I wanted, but I'm going to create a P element. And every time I do a command right now, I'm going to stop. I'm going to rerun it. I'm going to walk through. Oh, by the way, I got to change. And this is good to know too. I got to change my breakpoint of cool because of where this is located. All right. So step in. I know that one. Now, when I do create element, in this case, if I go look, like if I just was to hit P, right? It would say, oh yeah, there's a P that I've created, an opening tag, a closing tag, elements. You can kind of think of them. Some people call them tags, some people call them elements. I think elements in this case more applies to the div, right? But it's a P. Okay, so it's a paragraph. So what this shows me though, if I go over to the HTML, is if I go into here, and even if I just do, I could look at the div at this point. But if you look here, you'll notice that that P paragraph is nowhere in there yet. Okay. Because I've only created it. I haven't actually updated the DOM. I've only created it. So I first said select that area, that div, now create a P. Okay. And now p.text content, right? To browser. Let's just say output to DOM. Okay. So what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, for that new P, right? Dot text content says set its text content. And we can even see that too in the browser, or sorry, in the DevTools. Okay, run it again. Oh, did it get? Yeah. Okay. So now we said selected, create the div. Now update that. A whole, right? Is not a function. Let me see what I did wrong here. Oh, yeah. I think actually what you need to do here is like here. Sometimes you call, in this case we call these methods that are built into here, but sometimes you just set their value. Let's see if that's what it was. Okay, let's run it. Cool. Now, so in this case we said on that new P paragraph element, set its content to this string. All right here. So we can come down here and we could type P. And so now we could show that that P paragraph is now got its text content. But what we know by looking in the elements is that it's still not in the DOM. It's not updated in the DOM. So now we get to do pretty much the last step of this update. And we're writing a function, so we can call it many times. Okay. So we're going to say, div element. So we're going to reference the variable we have above, dot append. Now there's different ways to append, but append is basically, you can think of it as updating the DOM. And the child would be what's underneath this div. We're going to update it with whatever was in that P. Okay. So check this out. Now I'm going to actually, instead of stepping through it, I'm just going to let it run. And so there we go, output to the DOM. So now we've written the steps to output to the DOM. Now, could we make this more flexible? Of course we could, right? At this point, we could actually create, instead of saying update to DOM here as a string, right? Because then it's only going to do that. We could tell it what we want to update it with by using this, and I want you to understand this argument, okay? So this is an argument that gets passed into the function that would then become a parameter, right? So let's just for a minute. Okay? So when you do arguments and parameters in JavaScript, okay, and I use, sometimes images are nice. There is an argument object we'll talk about later. But for the purposes of this, and let's see it in JavaScript, here's a good one, okay, is that when we invoke a function and we pass it, okay, arguments, when they are passed into the function, they become parameters, okay? So in this case, right, our argument is a string. We're creating a locally scoped variable, declaring it as input. Okay, we've already assigned it by passing it. And now what we can say is input is what we want to update that P for. Okay, all right, so well, what would happen? Let's actually go here. Same thing happens. Okay, now we could step through it. And by the way, I recommend you at this point step through that function. Okay, so let's go back over here. And now let's say, instead of this, could we just type 100? Does it matter? Because we're updating a paragraph, but it doesn't matter what we send to this function, right? Okay, so let's run this, 100. And what you can do here is you can, again, set a breakpoint, refresh the page, step. Okay, we see we're passing in 100. So argument, parameter, we're saying, look at that div, okay? Create a P. Let's go ahead and walk through these. Remember, each time each one of these lines run, you can either roll your mouse over it, which is awesome, and then you can just hit step. And over here, and this is great to make this smaller, you can actually see over here that line like I showed you last week. Hit step, okay, input, step, Now at this point, it's done everything it needed to do. It updated the div, and now it sends control back to what called it, and then boom, it's done. Now remember, I showed you last week, once you got here, you get, depending on your setup, you may get another file open, but you can just hit play through, and basically it just plays through that. Okay, here's what I want you to do for this first part. I want you to now commit this code. Actually, I want you to do this. I want you to play around with this code, right? Play around with this code a little bit. See what you could change, at least one change to this code. And then this just you commit, and your commit would be, right, at this point, right? Updated DOM, my changes would be your commit message, right? So if I'm actually, I hope at this point you have the commit messages down. So we're going to do several other commits here, and then we'll pick it up on the next one.